The history of the mermaid begins 3,000 years before the first sailor hallucinated a woman in the waves of the Atlantic. It begins in the rocky, arid landscape of ancient Syria, specifically in the Philistine city of Ascalon. Here, amidst the limestone and the dust, the ancients worshipped a deity of immense and terrifying power, Atargatis, the great mother of northern Syria. She stood as a figure of civilization, fertility, and protection, holding the social order of the Near East in her hands. To understand the mermaid, one must first strip away the medieval layers of demonic temptation and return to this moment of absolute divinity. Atargatis was the primary architect of the region's spiritual life, a sovereign entity whose influence rivaled the greatest gods of the Babylonian pantheon. Her sanctuary at Ascalon was an architectural marvel, dominated not by a statue in a dark room, but by a massive, open-air sacred lake. This body of water served as the focal point of the city's daily ritual life. The Greek historian Diodorus Siculus, writing centuries later, described the waters as teeming with fish that were forbidden to touch. These were strictly sacred avatars of the goddess herself. The citizens of Ascalon believed the fish possessed the souls of the divine, and the consumption of their flesh was a taboo punishable by severe religious censure. The lake functioned as a boundary between the mortal and the divine, a liquid altar where the goddess communicated with her people. The myth of her transformation, the patient zero event of mermaid mythology, originates from a collision between this divine order and chaotic desire. According to the legend recorded by Ctesias of Cnidus, Atargatis drew the ire of Aphrodite, the Greek goddess of love. In a targeted act of divine sabotage, Aphrodite struck the Syrian goddess with an overwhelming, unnatural lust for a mortal youth. This youth was a simple shepherd named Chaistros, a man who existed entirely outside the sphere of royal divinity. Under the influence of this curse, Atargatis descended from her high altar and engaged in a passionate, illicit affair with the mortal. The consequences of this union were immediate and catastrophic. Atargatis conceived a child, the future legendary queen Semiramis, and the reality of her situation shattered the spell of lust. The goddess awoke to the horror of her degradation. She had compromised her divine purity by coupling with a human, an act that destabilized her status as the untouchable Queen of Heaven. Overcome by a profound, divine shame, she initiated a violent purge of her own life. She abandoned her newborn daughter in the rocky wilderness to be raised by doves and, in a final act of grief, killed the shepherd lover who had been the instrument of her fall. Seeking total oblivion, Atargatis threw herself into the sacred lake of Ascalon. Her intent was oblivion, a desire to extinguish her consciousness and her form in the dark waters. However, the water refused to conceal her beauty. The elements themselves conspired to preserve her divinity, rejecting her attempt to die. Instead of drowning, the goddess underwent a metamorphosis. The powers of the lake enveloped her, allowing her to retain her human form above the waist, preserving the beauty that defined her godhood, while transforming her lower half into that of a fish. This moment marks the genesis of the biological template that would haunt maritime folklore for the next 3 millennia. The Dirce, or Dirceto figure, as the Greeks later called her, established the iconography of the mermaid, a hybrid creature of dual nature. Yet, unlike the Sirens of the Odyssey or the monsters of the medieval maps, this creature was not a predator. She was a tragic divinity. Her fishtail represented her sanctuary. The first mermaid stood in stark contrast to the predators of later folklore. She was a goddess who fled into the deep, to escape the pain of human love. The distinction between the Atargatis archetype and the later European mermaid lies in the precise theological function of the hybrid form. In the cosmologies of the ancient Near East, the ocean often represented Tiamat, a realm of chaotic, primordial destruction that required a storm god to tame it. Atargatis reversed this dynamic. She embodied the imposition of order upon that chaos. Her hybrid nature signified a total dominion over the elements. She controlled the fertility of the earth through her upper body and the bounty of the waters through her lower half. The fishtail, in this specific historical context, functioned as a symbol of harvest and life-sustaining abundance, standing in direct opposition to the predatory danger associated with the open sea. Lucian of Samosata, the Syrian satirist writing in the 2nd century AD, provides the most detailed account of her iconography in his text on the Syrian goddess. He describes a clear bifurcation in how she was depicted. In the great temple at Hierapolis, modern Manbij, she appeared entirely human, seated on a throne flanked by lions, visually indistinguishable from the Anatolian mother goddess, Cybele. However, Lucian notes that in the coastal shrines of Phoenicia, specifically at Ascalon, she retained the Dirce form, a woman from the waist up, tapering into a fish. This regional variant suggests that the fish form was a localized maritime expression of her power, a specific theological dialect spoken by the people who lived and died by the sea. The numismatic evidence preserves this image of civilized divinity. Silver coins minted by the Seleucid king Demetrius III, circa 95 BC, feature the goddess Atargatis on the reverse. These artifacts present a crucial visual detail that separates the goddess from the monster, the polo's crown. In these depictions, Atargatis wears a tall, turreted headpiece, resembling the walls of a city. This crown identifies her as a Tyche, a protector of the city-state and a guardian of civic walls. It explicitly frames her as a creature of urbanization and law. Contrast this with the medieval mermaid, whose iconography is defined by loose, flowing hair, a universal symbol of loose morals, wildness, and a lack of social restraint. The Atargatis figure on the coins is bound, braided, and crowned. Her hybridity is a structured theological statement. She combines the strength of the lion, earth, the abundance of the fish, water, and the governance of the crown, civilization. She represents a system of the world where the wet and the dry cooperate to sustain human life. This benevolent interpretation held firm for centuries, but the seeds of its corruption were present in the geography itself. As the cult moved west, leaving the protective walls of Ascalon and entering the philosophical blender of the Greek archipelago, the nuance of the fertile fish began to fade. The Greeks, with their deep-seated cultural anxiety regarding the ocean, struggled to interpret a goddess who wore the skin of a sea creature. They possessed their own avian monsters of the coastline, the Sirens, and as the two cultures collided, the divine fishwoman of Syria began her slow, tragic migration toward the monstrous birdwomen of the Odyssey. The cult of Atargatis relied on the vectors of commerce to escape the Levant. The Phoenicians, the premier navigators of the Iron Age, served as the carriers of this theological contagion. As they established trade networks stretching from Carthage to the Aegean, they transported their patron goddess in the hold of their cedar ships. This transmission process centered heavily on the island of Cyprus, a geographic and cultural mixing bowl where the Semitic East collided with the emerging Greek West. Here, the goddess underwent a profound rebranding. The Greeks, encountering this powerful queen of the ocean, absorbed her functions while rejecting her alien anatomy. In the Greek pantheon, the powerful fish-tailed Atargatis dissolved and reformed as Aphrodite, the goddess of love. The etymological link preserves the aquatic origin. The name Aphrodite stems from the Greek aphros, meaning sea foam, referencing her birth from the churning waves. However, the Hellenic aesthetic demanded anthropomorphic perfection. The Greeks actively purged the fish form from her iconography, viewing the hybrid body as a sign of monstrosity rather than divinity. Aphrodite rose from the sea as a flawless human woman, stripping the mermaid archetype of its divine status and leaving behind a biological vacancy in the ocean. The role of the divine fish woman ceased to exist in the high culture of the West. Despite this aesthetic purge, the memory of the fish goddess survived in the margins of Greek astronomy and myth. The constellation Pisces serves as the celestial tomb of Atargatis. The Greek myth, explaining the constellation, describes Aphrodite and her son Eros fleeing the approach of the Titan Typhon. Terrorized by the monster, they leaped into the Euphrates River and transformed into two fish to escape detection. This narrative is a direct, fossilized preservation of the original Syrian tragedy. It repeats the core motif, the divine female diving into the water and changing shape to escape a threat. This survival, however, came with a demotion. The fish form devolved from a state of permanent majesty into a temporary disguise, a mechanism of flight and fear. By the classical era, the ocean of the Greek imagination had ceased to be the domain of a benevolent hybrid goddess. It had become a wild, ungoverned space populated by nereids and tritons, but devoid of a central fish mother. This theological vacuum created the perfect conditions for a new, far more dangerous hybrid to take ownership of the water. With the fish goddess banished to the stars, the stage was set for the bird woman of the underworld to descend from the cliffs and claim the sea. The image in your head, the mermaid on the rock, is a lie planted by 19th century art. The creature that confronted Odysseus shared no DNA with the fish goddess Atargatis. The text of the epic, composed in the 8th century BC, presents a monster that is terrestrial and avian. When the witch Circe warns Odysseus of the dangers ahead, she describes the Sirens as creatures who sit within a landscape that defies the standard maritime trope of the jagged rock. She describes a meadow, lush with wildflowers and heavy with the scent of land. This setting, the Anthemoessa, or Flowery Isle, is the first component of their trap. The Sirens inhabit a horizontal, verdant space that signals safety to a weary sailor. It mimics the comfort of home, offering a visual respite from the grey, heaving hostility of the open ocean. However, Homer brutally subverts this pastoral image in the very next line. He describes the meadow as a charnel house. The green grass hides a sprawling, grotesque heap of men's bones, some still clad in rotting skin, skins shriveling around them. The Sirens kill by a slow, agonizing starvation. They entrance the sailors, drawing them onto the beach where they sit, paralyzed by the song, until they wither away into skeletons. The visual evidence for this avian anatomy is absolute. For the first 1,000 years of her existence, the Siren was a bird woman. Every surviving piece of archaic and classical Greek pottery depicts them as ornithomorphic hybrids. On a famous Corinthian Aryballos perfume jar dating to 570 BC, the Sirens appear as massive raptors with human heads, perched on the gunwales of a ship. They possess the talons of vultures and the wings of eagles. This anatomy aligns them strictly with the element of air, separating them entirely from the nereids and oceanids who populated the water. This choice of form carries a specific theological weight. In the visual language of the ancient Mediterranean, the soul bird, or Ba, an Egyptian concept, represented the spirit of the dead liberated from the body. By giving the sirens the body of a bird and the head of a woman, the Greeks identified them as chthonic entities, spirits of the underworld. They were not marine predators evolving from fish. They were death spirits who had migrated to the coast. Their closest mythological cousins were the harpies and the keres, the winged fates of the battlefield. The confusion began much later, but in the time of Homer, the distinction remained rigid. The ocean belonged to the monsters of the deep, Scylla the Hydra, and Charybdis the whirlpool. The coastline belonged to the Sirens. They functioned as a border patrol between the living world of the sea and the dying world of the land. They sat on their heap of bones, watching the ships pass, representing a danger that came from the air and the intellect, rather than the crushing depths. The mechanism of the Siren's threat reinforces this terrestrial nature. While Scylla physically snatches sailors and Charybdis swallows entire ships, the Sirens engage in no physical violence. Their weapon is entirely non-kinetic. They rely on the enchantment, thelxis, a psychological binding that forces the victim to destroy himself. When Odysseus prepares to face them, he orders his men to plug their ears with beeswax, rendering them deaf to the threat. He alone chooses to hear, commanding his crew to bind him to the mast. This scene, the binding of Odysseus, serves as the central icon of the myth. It represents the triumph of the rational mind, civilization, over the chaotic impulse of the song, nature. But what was the song? Popular culture assumes it was a call of seduction, a promise of carnal delight that lured lonely sailors. This assumption is a fundamental misreading of the text. The Sirens in the Odyssey make no mention of love, carnal pleasure, or physical comfort. They offer a commodity far more dangerous to the Greek mind and far more tempting to a hero like Odysseus. They offer the one thing a mortal cannot have: total, godlike omniscience. To understand the true danger of the Siren, we must analyze the lyrics of their song. Homer provides us with the exact transcript of their appeal in Book 12, lines 184 to 191. When they call out to Odysseus, they do not mention the comforts of home, the pleasure of a bed, or the taste of food. They begin by flattering his ego, addressing him by his formal heroic epithet. "Come hither, renowned Odysseus, great glory of the Achaeans." This opening salvo establishes that they know exactly who he is. They are not mindless predators attracting prey with generic noise. They are intelligent entities engaging a specific target with a customized appeal. They recognize his status as a veteran of Troy, and they use that identity as the hook to draw him in. The core of their offer follows immediately, and it is entirely cerebral. They chant, "For we know all the toils that the Argives and Trojans endured on the wide plains of Troy through the will of the gods." This is a staggering claim. The Sirens are asserting that they possess the complete, unedited historical record of the Trojan War. For a man like Odysseus, who has spent 10 years fighting that war and another 10 trying to survive its aftermath, this offer is psychologically devastating. He is a man obsessed with his own legacy, with his kleos, glory. The Sirens offer him the chance to hear his own story told by divine witnesses, to validate his suffering with the objective truth of the gods. But their promise extends beyond history. They conclude their verse with the terrifying assertion, "And we know all that happens on the fruitful earth." This is the definition of omniscience. The Sirens are offering the God's eye view of the universe. In the Greek worldview, such knowledge belongs strictly to the Muses, the 9 goddesses of inspiration who reside on Mount Olympus. By making this claim, the Sirens are positioning themselves as the dark muses of the sea. They offer the same product, total knowledge, but without the divine safety controls. To know all that happens is to carry a burden that the mortal mind is not designed to bear. The parallel between the Siren and the Muse is not accidental. It is the structural key to the myth. Both groups of entities are female, both sing, and both claim to know the past and the future. In the Iliad, the poet asks the Muses to help him because you are goddesses, you are there, and you know all things. The Sirens use nearly identical language. This suggests that the Sirens represent the dangerous, unregulated counterpart to the Olympian Muses. If the Muses inspire the poet to create art that grants immortality through fame, the Sirens offer the raw, unfiltered knowledge itself, a direct injection of truth that bypasses the need for art and leads directly to death. This distinction explains why the Siren's song is fatal. The human mind requires narrative, structure, and distance to process the tragedy of existence. The Muses provide that distance. They turn the horror of war into the beauty of epic poetry. The Sirens, however, remove the filter. They offer the raw data of the universe, the unvarnished reality of all the toils. To hear this total truth is to become paralyzed by it. The sailor who listens forgets his wife, his son, and his destination, because the mundane details of his human life are rendered meaningless by the overwhelming scale of the Siren's knowledge. He starves to death, not because he is trapped, but because he loses the will to participate in a finite, mortal existence. Scholars like Pietro Pucci have argued that the Sirens are essentially reciting the Iliad to Odysseus. They are offering him the text of the poem that defines him. This creates a fascinating metafictional paradox. Odysseus is a character in the Odyssey, a story of return survival, being tempted by the Iliad, a story of war, death. The Sirens are trying to pull him back into the narrative of the glorious dead. If he stops to listen, he accepts that his life is over, that he is a historical figure rather than a living man. To sail past them is to choose life, with all its ignorance and uncertainty, over the seductive perfection of a completed death. This interpretation radically recontextualizes the seductive aspect of the Siren. The lust they provoke transcends the body. It is a lust for the absolute. It is an intellectual seduction. The Greeks understood that the desire to know what happens next, or what really happened, is as potent a biological drive as hunger or procreation. The Siren exploits the curiosity that defines the human species. In the context of the Odyssey, Odysseus is defined by his cleverness, his metis. He is the man who wants to know everything. Therefore, the Sirens are designed specifically to kill him. They are the ultimate trap for the intellectual man, using his greatest strength, his mind, against him. Furthermore, the price of this knowledge is the cessation of action. The pile of bones in the meadow represents the physical cost of total intellectual absorption. In the ancient world, motion was life. To be a hero was to move, to act, to sail, to fight. To sit still and listen was to simulate death. The Sirens induce a state of catatonic contemplation. They turn the active hero into a passive audience member. By stopping on the beach to consume the content of the Siren's song, the sailors cease to be the protagonists of their own lives and become mere consumers of a story that has already ended. The rejection of this offer is what makes Odysseus a hero of the new age. By filling his men's ears with wax, He acknowledges that there are things human beings should not hear. He accepts the limitations of the mortal condition. By binding himself to the mast, he creates a physical mechanism to restrain his own hubris. He wants to hear the truth, but he knows that the truth is lethal. This scene establishes the technological solution to the problem of the siren. You cannot fight them with weapons, and you cannot debate them with logic. You can only survive them by restricting your own senses, by admitting that you are too weak to handle the song. Finally, we must note the tragic implications for the sirens themselves. Their existence is predicated on the success of their trap. In later mythography, a condition is added to their existence. If a mortal hears their song and escapes, the sirens must die. Their power is absolute. It cannot allow for exceptions. By surviving, Odysseus breaks the logic of their divinity. He proves that a man can know the truth and live. This violation of the natural order foreshadows the end of the monstrous era of Greek myth and the beginning of the human era. The bird women of the meadow are defeated not by an arrow, but by a piece of rope and a ball of wax. The classification of the siren as a mere biological predator collapses when we examine the archaeological context of the classical period. While the poets described them as monsters, the sculptors placed them in the most tender and sacred of all human spaces, the cemetery. In the necropolises of Athens and Myrina, the siren appears frequently in the role of a devoted mourner. This is the funerary siren, a figure carved onto tombstones to watch over the deceased. In this context, the siren acts as a psychopomp, a conductor of souls. Her role is to bridge the gap between the living world and the realm of Hades, using her song to soothe the terrifying transition of death. This function creates a jarring paradox in the mythology. The same creature that lures sailors to a gruesome death by starvation also serves as the comforting guardian of the beloved dead. This dual nature makes sense only if we view the siren as an entity of the border. She exists on the coastline, the border of land and sea, and on the tombstone, the border of life and death. Her song is a sonic threshold. For the living sailor who has not yet finished his journey, crossing that threshold is premature and fatal. But for the soul that has already died, the siren's song becomes the necessary frequency that guides them home. The origin of this funerary function likely predates the Greeks entirely, pointing back to the theology of Egypt. The Egyptian concept of the bar represented the personality or soul of the deceased, depicted artistically as a bird with a human head. The bar would fly out of the tomb during the day to watch the living and return to the mummy at night. It is highly probable that the Greeks, in their early contact with Egypt, adopted this visual motif of the soul bird and merged it with their own folklore of the dangerous, singing demon. This synthesis explains the behavior of the siren on Attic grave goods. She is frequently depicted playing the lyre or the aulos, double flute, but she is also shown engaging in distinct ritual gestures of mourning, tearing her hair, beating her breast, and scratching her cheeks. These are the codified actions of the Myloloi, the ritual lamentation performed by women at funerals. By assigning these actions to the siren, the Greeks domesticated the monster. They transformed the song of death from a weapon that kills you into a hymn that mourns you. This capacity for grief separates the siren from purely bestial monsters like the Hydra. It suggests that the siren, despite her monstrous form, understands the tragedy of the human condition. While Odysseus survived the sirens through restraint and denial, the other great maritime myth of antiquity presents a radically different solution. In the Argonautica, written by Apollonius of Rhodes in the 3rd century BC, Jason and the Argonauts must pass the same deadly meadow. However, their defense relies strictly on the divine talent of a musician. Orpheus. When the Argo approaches the island and the deadly melody begins to waft over the water, the crew ignores the option of beeswax. Orpheus realizes that silence is an insufficient defense against the call of the void. He understands that the only way to defeat the song of death is to drown it out with a song of life. Orpheus stands at the prow and strikes his lyre. He begins to sing a hymn to the gods of Olympus, playing a melody of perfect mathematical rhythm. This creates a literal countersong, antiphony. The encounter transforms into a metaphysical duel between two opposing forces of the universe. The sirens represent the chthonic forces of nature, wild, chaotic, seductive, and entropic. Their voice is the sound of wind, storm, and biological decay. Orpheus, conversely, represents the Apollonian forces of civilization. His music is structured, tuned, and rhythmic. It imposes order upon the airwaves. By playing his lyre, Orpheus is restructuring the reality around the ship, enforcing the laws of harmony to create a protective barrier that the chaotic frequency of the sirens cannot penetrate. Despite the overwhelming power of Orpheus's music, the victory was not total. The myth records a single casualty, the hero Butes. Even with the divine harmony of the lyre filling the air, Butes heard the faint, underlying frequency of the sirens. Overcome by the lust for the absolute, he broke rank, leaped over the gunwales, and swam frantically toward the island. This detail serves as a critical psychological footnote. It suggests that for some personalities, the call of self-destruction is stronger than the order of civilization. Orpheus could protect the group, but he could not save the individual who wanted to be lost. Butes serves as the sacrificial anode for the crew. His leap validates the power of the sirens, even in their defeat. However, the intervention of the goddess Aphrodite saved him from the starving death of the meadow. She plucked him from the waves and deposited him safely in Sicily. This divine rescue reinforces the transitional nature of the Argonautica. We are moving away from the grim inevitability of Homer's world into a more romanticized era, where the gods actively mitigate the horror of the monsters. But for the sirens themselves, the escape of the Argo had far darker consequences. The logic of Greek mythology operates on a rigid, binary framework. A monster exists solely to challenge a hero. If the hero overcomes the challenge, the monster loses its ontological reason for existing. The prophecy governing the sirens was explicit and unforgiving. It dictated that if a single ship sailed past their meadow unharmed, the sirens were required to cast themselves into the sea and perish. The survival of Odysseus, or the Argonauts, depending on the tradition, triggered this self-destruct mechanism. The escape of the prey signaled the obsolescence of the predator. Following the passage of the hero's ship, the sirens flung themselves from the heights of Anthemoessa. This act of mass self-destruction represents a critical turning point in the history of the Mediterranean bestiary. The creatures of the air voluntarily surrendered to the water. In doing so, they underwent a geological transubstantiation. The myth asserts that their drowning bodies rejected decomposition, choosing instead to calcify. They transformed into the rocks and reefs that line the Tyrrhenian coast of Italy. The three small islands known today as the Sirenus, or Lee Galli, off the Amalfi coast, stand as the fossilized remains of the sisters who failed to seduce the mind of the West. The legacy of this self-destruction birthed one of the great cities of the ancient world. One specific siren, named Parthenope, the maidenly voice, washed ashore on the coast of Campania. Her corpse became the focal point of a major religious cult. The Greek colonists who settled the region revered her strictly as a fallen tutelary deity. They erected a tomb in her honor and established an annual torch race to propitiate her spirit. Around this tomb grew the city of Parthenope, which later expanded into Neapolis, the modern city of Naples. This etiological myth anchors the siren firmly in the geography of the real world. For the Neapolitans of antiquity, the siren was the genius loci, the protective spirit of the place. Her death was the seed from which their civilization grew. This completes the cycle of the avian siren. She began as a goddess in Syria, evolved into a bird monster in Greece, and ended as a tomb spirit in Italy. By the time of the Roman Empire, the bird women were effectively extinct. They were dead, buried, and turned to stone. The air was clear. However, nature abhors a vacuum. The disappearance of the avian sirens left the ocean psychologically empty. The sailors of the late Roman and early medieval periods still felt the fear of the deep, and they still heard voices in the wind. They needed a name for the terror of the water. Slowly, the identity of the siren began to detach from the dead birds of the Odyssey and migrate into the dark, unexplored waters of the Atlantic. The stage was set for the great mutation. The moment the wings would fall off, the tail would grow, and the siren would return to her original, ancient form, the fish. The extinction of the siren was short-lived. While the birdwomen of the Greek coast turned to stone, their name survived to infect a new and far more influential text, the Bible. In the 3rd century BC, the Jewish community of Alexandria undertook a massive project to translate their Hebrew scriptures into Greek, a work known as the Septuagint. This translation served as the bridge between the Semitic and Hellenic worlds. However, translation is rarely a mathematically perfect exchange. It requires interpretation, and in the gap between the Hebrew tan and the Greek vocabulary, the siren found a new home. The crisis occurred in the book of Isaiah, chapter 13, verse 21. The prophet Isaiah is describing the future desolation of Babylon, predicting that the great city will fall and become a haunt for wild beasts. The original Hebrew text lists the creatures that will inhabit the ruins: owls, ostriches, and a creature called the tan, plural tanim. Zoologically, the tan refers to the jackal, a scavenging canine known for its mournful, wailing cry in the night. The translators, however, faced a dilemma. They sought a word that conveyed not just the biology of a wild dog, but the theological horror of a desolate, haunted place. Instead of using the Greek word for jackal, the translators made a specific cultural choice. They translated tanim as sirenes. In the Septuagint, Isaiah 13:21 reads, "And sirens shall rest there, and demons shall dance there." This decision was likely driven by the auditory parallel. The jackal's howl is high-pitched, wailing, and human-like, remarkably similar to the legendary song of the siren. By using this word, the translators injected a specific Greek mythological monster into the canonical history of the Hebrew prophets. This translation had a profound destabilizing effect on the creature's identity. In the Odyssey, the siren was strictly a coastal entity. She belonged to the sea and the cliffs. In the Septuagint, the siren was forcibly relocated to the desert. She became a monster of dry places, of ruins, and of abandonment. This shattered the rigid bird woman of the sea archetype. If a siren could live in the dry ruins of Babylon, she was no longer bound by her avian anatomy or her maritime geography. She became a shapeshifter, a floating signifier for something that wails in the dark. Centuries later, when St. Jerome produced the Latin Vulgate, the definitive Bible of the Catholic Church, he solidified this error. In Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Micah, wherever the Hebrew text described jackals or ostriches wailing, Jerome often maintained the word Siren. Because the Bible was the ultimate authority on truth in the Middle Ages, the existence of the siren became a matter of dogma, not just folklore. To deny the siren was to deny the prophet Isaiah. However, the Bible remained completely silent regarding the physical description of these sirens. It stated they lived in ruins and wailed, omitting any mention of wings. This lack of descriptive detail created a visual vacuum. The word sirena existed in the text, but the image of the classical bird woman had faded from the collective consciousness of Western Europe. Into this vacuum rushed the ancient, suppressed memory of the water goddess. Slowly, the linguistic drift began to merge with local European folklore of water sprites. The logic followed a new path. The siren is a temptress. Water is the element of desire and flux. Therefore, the siren must be aquatic. Without the strict bird definition of Homer to hold them back, medieval illustrators began to experiment. They looked for a form that suited a demon of temptation. And from the depths of cultural memory, the form of Atargatis, the woman with the fishtail, began to re-emerge, ready to reclaim the name that had been stolen from her. The confusion created by the Bible simmered for centuries until an anonymous Anglo-Saxon scholar attempted to resolve it in the late 7th or early 8th century. The text is known as the Liber Monstrorum de Diversis Generibus, the Book of Monsters of Various Kinds. This manuscript represents a crucial moment in the history of the imagination, the attempt to catalogue the nightmares of the world. The author, likely working in the intellectual climate of Aldhelm or the Venerable Bede, sought to create a definitive encyclopedia of every strange beast known to man. When he reached the entry for Siren, he made a decision that permanently altered the trajectory of the myth. The entry begins by acknowledging the classical tradition, but immediately pivots to a new reality. The text defines the sirens as sea-girls, who deceive sailors with the outstanding beauty of their form and the sweetness of their singing. This phrasing, Marinai Puellai, sea-girls, is a radical departure from the Odyssey. It explicitly ties the creature to the ocean, stripping away the desert habitat of the Septuagint. The author effectively overrules the biblical jackal translation in favor of the maritime folklore of Northern Europe. The Liber Monstrorum provides the first extant written description of the mermaid anatomy as we know it today. The author writes, "From the head to the navel, they have the body of a maiden and are essentially like the human race, but they have scaly fishes' tails with which they always move in the depths." This sentence is the smoking gun of the mutation. It cements the fishtail as the primary mode of locomotion. The scales, squamosas, replace the feathers. The creature ceased to be an aerial threat, evolving into a fully submarine biological entity. However, the transition was not instant. The author displays a fascinating moment of intellectual hesitation. He admits that, in older times, these creatures were depicted with wings and talons. To reconcile this, he engages in a clumsy biological synthesis, suggesting that perhaps they have both. But the emphasis falls heavily on the fishtail. This hesitation reveals the tension between authority, old books say birds, and experience, sailors say fish. The author chooses experience. He validates the stories of the Atlantic sailors over the poetry of Homer. This shift in geography plays a critical role in the mutation. The Liber Monstrorum was a product of the Atlantic world, likely England or Ireland. The Mediterranean of the Greeks was a sea of rocky islands and cliffs, suitable for birds. The North Atlantic, however, was a vast, cold, featureless expanse of water. For a sailor in the North Sea, the danger originated exclusively from the freezing depths. The monsters of the north were aquatic: the kraken, the whale, the sea serpent. To survive in the northern imagination, the siren had to adapt to the local environment. She evolved gills and fins because the cultural ecosystem demanded a water monster. The publication of the Liber Monstrorum marked the death knell of the avian siren in the popular consciousness. While scholars would continue to copy the old bird images in obscure manuscripts for a few more centuries, the fishwoman had won the war for the imagination. The definition provided by this text became the standard reference for the next 1,000 years. It bridged the gap between the ancient goddess Atargatis and the medieval demon. This anatomical shift also solved the problem of desire. A birdwoman with talons is a terrifying predator, but she is difficult to sexualize. A woman with the lower body of a fish, however, presents a different semiotic image. She is wet, cold, and slippery, traits the medieval church associated with feminine deception and lust. The fishtail allowed the siren to become a symbol of the sin of the flesh, in a way the bird body never could. The scales suggested a cold-blooded lack of soul, while the bare human torso suggested availability. By the time the High Middle Ages arrived, the siren was exclusively a mermaid. The Liber Monstrorum had done its work. It had taken a confused, contradictory set of myths and standardized them into a single, recognizable icon. The creature that emerged from this text was ready to be carved into the stone columns of every cathedral in Europe. She had shed her role as a muse of the underworld, reborn as a demon of the deep, waiting for the moral allegory that would turn her into a weapon of the church. While the Liber Monstrorum gave the siren her body, the text known as the Physiologus gave her a soul, or rather, a specific purpose within the Christian cosmos. Written in Alexandria between the 2nd and 4th centuries AD, and translated into every major European language, the Physiologus became the second most widely read book in Christendom after the Bible. It operated on a premise that defined the medieval worldview, that the natural world was a second scripture. Every animal, from the lion to the ant, existed solely to teach humanity a specific moral lesson encoded by God during creation. In this book of nature, the siren appears as a central figure of warning. The standard bestiary entry for the siren follows a rigid structure. First the description, then the significatio, the meaning. The text describes the siren as a creature of the sea, shaped like a woman from the head to the navel, and like a fish from the navel down. This acceptance of the fish form by the primary educational text of the Church standardized the image across Europe. However, the bestiary was unconcerned with the biological reality of the creature. Its focus remained entirely on the moral anatomy. The primary moral assignment for the siren was the sin of duplicity. The bestiary writers seized upon the hybrid nature of the body, beautiful human flesh joined to cold, scaly fish, as the perfect symbol for the hypocrite. The text explicitly compares the siren to the double-minded man, vir duplex animo, mentioned in the Epistle of James. She represents the congregant who speaks with the voice of an angel inside the church, but acts with the rapacious appetite of a beast once he leaves the sanctuary. This interpretation transformed the horror of the siren from an external threat into an internal one. In the Odyssey, the siren was a monster you sailed past. In the Physiologus, the siren was a mirror. She embodied the danger of wearing a mask of civility while harboring a soul of chaos. The tail became the hidden sin, the secret vice that the sinner drags behind him. submerged in the dark waters of his private life, while his human face smiles at the world. The mechanic of the Siren's attack also underwent a theological update. In the classical tradition, the Siren killed through the paralysis of knowledge. In the bestiary tradition, she kills through the induction of sleep. The text warns that the Siren sings a sweet, lulling melody that causes the sailors to fall into a heavy stupor. This sleep represents acedia, sloth, spiritual lethargy, and the neglect of one's salvation. The Siren does not offer the truth of the universe anymore. She offers the comfort of ignorance and the pleasure of worldly distraction. Once the sailor is asleep, the bestiary describes the violence explicitly. Then the Sirens enter the ship and tear the flesh of the sleeping men. This shift to physical rending is significant. It marks the transition of the Siren from an intellectual adversary to a physical predator of the soul. The tearing of the flesh symbolizes the destruction of the sinner's virtue while he is unaware. The lesson is vigilance. The Christian soul must remain awake like Odysseus, who was reinterpreted as a Christ figure bound to the mast of the cross, to survive the seduction of the world. Comparison with the classical myth reveals the shrinking of the Siren's dignity. The Greek Siren challenged the hero's mind. The medieval Siren merely exploits the sinner's weakness. She became a test of moral fortitude rather than intellectual capacity. By reducing her song to a lullaby of flattery and lust, the Church successfully neutered the ancient goddess of wisdom, reducing her to a warning label against the dangers of going to sleep in church. To fully grasp why the Siren became a figure of absolute evil in the Middle Ages, one must understand the theological reputation of water itself. In the medieval Christian worldview, the elements were strictly moralized. The earth, dry land, represented the domain of God's order, the place where Adam was created and where the church stood. The ocean, conversely, represented the abyss, the primordial chaos that existed before creation. In the opening verses of Genesis, the act of creating a habitable world consists of separating the waters. God pushes back the wet chaos to create a dry, safe space for humanity. Therefore, the ocean is the remnant of the pre-creation void. It is the part of the universe that resists the structure of divine law. This hydrophobia permeates the entire biblical canon. The ocean functions as the mechanism of judgment, the flood, the home of the Leviathan, and the barrier to the promised land. In the prophetic vision of St. John in the book of Revelation, the final perfection of the world is announced with the cryptic phrase, "And there was no more sea." The ultimate victory of God involves the total evaporation of the ocean. Within this cosmology, the Siren is a native citizen of the enemy territory. She is an ambassador from the abyss, a creature who thrives in the very element that God intends to destroy. The cartography of the period visualizes this anxiety perfectly. The standard Mappa Mundi depicts the habitable world as a disk of order surrounded by a terrifying circular river known as Oceanus. This outer ring represented the limit of human knowledge and the beginning of the monstrous. By placing the Siren in this marginal zone, the medieval geographers identified her as a boundary creature. She patrols the edge where the known world dissolves into the unknown. Her fishtail identifies her as belonging to the realm of flux, instability, and formlessness, standing in direct opposition to the stability of the land-dwelling Christian. This elemental dualism carries a heavy gendered subtext. Medieval medicine and philosophy, relying on the Galenic theory of humours, classified the feminine as wet and cold, and the masculine as dry and hot. The Siren, as a wet-cold female hybrid, became the hyper-feminine nightmare. she embodied the fear of dissolution, the fear that the masculine structure of the church and the soul would be dissolved by the fluid, chaotic nature of female desire. She represented the liquid state that drowns the solid state. The linguistic connection between the ocean and destruction is embedded in the Hebrew word for the deep, tehom. This word shares a root with Tiamat, the Babylonian dragon goddess of chaos. The siren acts as the medieval avatar of this ancient dragon. She is the mouth of the deep. In many bestiaries, the danger of the siren is explicitly linked to the danger of being swallowed, either by the whale, Aspidocolone, or by the whirlpool, Charybdis. The siren serves as the lure that draws the sailor into the mouth of the ocean. This theological framework explains why the siren's beauty is always described as a surface trap. Just as the ocean has a glittering, calm surface that hides a crushing, dark depth, the siren has a beautiful face that hides a monstrous tail. The visual anatomy of the mermaid mimics the ocean itself, inviting on top, deadly underneath. To trust the siren is to make the same mistake as trusting a calm sea. Both are treacherous entities that promise passage but deliver death. Furthermore, the wetness of the siren linked her to the concept of luxuria, lust, surpassing the symbolic capacity of dry monsters like dragons or griffins. Water was the element of baptism, but it was also the element of flood and judgment. A corrupted water spirit represented an anti-baptism. Instead of washing away sin, the siren immerses the victim in it. She drags the soul down into the mire of the deep, profundum, a theological term often used as a synonym for hell. Finally, this theology of water clarifies the ultimate destiny of the siren in the Christian imagination. She cannot be redeemed because her very substance, the hybrid flesh of the ocean, is contrary to the nature of heaven. In the medieval mind, salvation is an ascent, going up towards the light and air. The siren's movement is always a descent, going down towards the dark and pressure. She is the gravity of sin made manifest. She is the weight that pulls the soul away from the sky and anchors it to the bottom of the abyss. The final victory of the fish over the bird occurred on the capitol columns of Europe's cathedrals. Between the 11th and 14th centuries, a specific architectural motif exploded across the continent: the Sirena Bicaudata, or twin-tailed mermaid. While the literary mermaid of the bestiary often had a single tail, the architectural mermaid frequently possessed two. In these carvings, the siren holds a tail in each hand, spreading them wide in a pose of explicit exhibitionism. This posture solved a geometric problem for the sculptor. It created a perfect symmetry suitable for the corner of a capital, but it also amplified the theological message. By splitting the tail, the artist created a visual euphemism for the open posture of the female body, yet safely categorized it as animal to avoid censorship. This specific iconography transformed the siren into the ultimate symbol of luxuria, lust. She appeared alongside the woman with snakes, a woman nursing serpents, as a warning against fleshly desire. However, the siren was far more popular. She can be found in hundreds of churches, from the rustic chapels of the Apennines to the great cathedrals of France, staring down at the monks during their prayers. She functioned as a stone sermon, a permanent reminder of the wet, chaotic danger that lurked outside the dry sanctuary of the church. Anthropologists identify this split-tail pose as a survival of far older, pagan motifs. It visually echoes the Sheila na gig of the British Isles and the Earth Mother figures of the Mediterranean, both of which use the gesture of ritual exposure to ward off evil or promote fertility. The medieval church co-opted this ancient protective gesture and inverted its meaning. What was once a symbol of life-giving fertility became a symbol of soul-destroying lasciviousness. The siren became the anti-virgin. Where the Virgin Mary was depicted with her body covered and contained, the siren was defined by her openness and exposure. The placement of these carvings reveals their function as liminal guardians. They almost always appear in transitional spaces, on the doorframes of portals, on the capitals supporting the roof, or on the corbels of the exterior eaves. They inhabit the boundaries of the sacred space. This placement reinforces the border creature status established in the Odyssey. Just as the Homeric siren patrolled the line between sea and land, the Romanesque siren patrols the line between the secular world and the holy ground. She represents the chaos that must be left behind when one enters the church. By the late Middle Ages, this twin-tailed form had become the definitive brand identity of the mermaid. When the printing press arrived in the 15th century, woodcuts standardized this image for the mass market. The most famous survival of this lineage is the 15th century woodcut of the Melusine of Nuremberg. This image depicts the twin-tailed siren wearing a crown, signifying her noble bloodline in European folklore. This specific woodcut possesses a staggering cultural longevity. It serves as the direct visual ancestor of the logo used by the Starbucks Coffee Corporation today. The modern green siren is a stylized, sanitized version of the medieval Sirena bicaudata. When consumers look at that cup, they are staring at a 12th century symbol of double-mindedness and lust, stripped of its theological venom, but retaining its ancient, hypnotic symmetry. The survival of this image proves the power of the great mutation. The bird is forgotten, but the split-tailed fish remains one of the most recognized icons in human history. With the iconography locked in stone and ink, the stage was set for the final evolution of the myth. The siren had moved from a goddess, Act 1, to a generic monster, Act 2. Now, in the High Middle Ages, she would become something new. She would become an ancestor. The legend of Melusine would take the abstract monster and give her a name, a family, and a tragedy that rivaled the Greek myths. The legend of Melusine is the most sophisticated literary expression of the mermaid archetype in Western history. Unlike the anonymous monsters of the bestiaries, Melusine has a name, a genealogy, and a specific geography. Her story was codified in the late 14th century by Jean d'Arras in his Roman de Melusine, 1393, written at the behest of the Duke of Berry. The tale originates deep within the forest of Colombier in the Poitou region of France. It starts with a tragedy that mirrors the ancient Atargatis myth, a fatal accident involving a mortal lover. The protagonist, Raymondin, a minor noble, is hunting boar with his uncle, the Count of Poitiers. In the chaos of the hunt, Raymondin's spear misses the beast and strikes his uncle, killing him instantly. Overcome with grief and terrified of being branded a regicide, Raymondin flees into the woods. He rides until he reaches the Fountain of Thirst, Fontaine de Soif. There, under the light of the moon, he encounters three mysterious ladies. The most beautiful among them, Melusine, approaches the weeping knight. She does not recoil from his bloody state. Instead, she greets him by name, revealing an omniscience that immediately marks her as a supernatural entity. Melusine offers Raymondin a lifeline. She promises to use her powers to clear his name of the accidental murder and to elevate him to the highest ranks of nobility. However, this supernatural aid comes with a strict contractual condition. This is the taboo motif, central to all folklore involving fairy brides. She agrees to marry him and bear his children, but he must swear a solemn oath. He must never attempt to see her on a Saturday. The specificity of the day is crucial. Saturday is the Sabbath, but in the context of the legend, It is the day of her transformation. Melusine explains that she wishes to withdraw into total privacy for 24 hours each week. She frames this request as a test of trust. If he respects this single boundary, they will reign as the greatest dynasty in France. If he violates it, their happiness will shatter and he will lose her forever. Desperate for salvation and captivated by her beauty, Raymondin swears the oath without hesitation. Following the marriage, the Melusine effect transforms the landscape. Unlike the destructive sirens of the Odyssey, Melusine functions as a hyper-productive culture hero. She is a builder of civilization. The legend credits her with the magical construction of the massive Château de Lusignan, as well as churches, monasteries, and fortified towns across the region. The text implies that she builds these structures by night, commanding legions of workmen or using her own fey magic to raise stone upon stone. This aspect of the legend serves a specific political purpose. The House of Lusignan, a real and powerful French dynasty that provided kings for Jerusalem and Cyprus, used the Melusine myth as a dynastic charter. By claiming descent from a supernatural water spirit, they legitimized their right to rule. They argued that their castles were not merely built by human hands, but were divinely ordained gifts from a fairy matriarch. Melusine represented the land itself, the fertility of the Poitou soil and the water, giving itself to the noble lord. The marriage proves incredibly fertile, producing 10 sons. However, the supernatural nature of the mother leaves a mark on the biology of the children. Each son is born with a distinct physical deformity, known as a mark of the fairy. One son, Urien, has ears comprising different lengths. Another, Geoffroy with the great tooth, possesses a boar's tusk protruding from his mouth. A third has 3 eyes. In the logic of the tale, these deformities function as narrative crumbs. They act as persistent reminders to Raymondin and the audience that Melusine is not a human woman. She is a hybrid entity, and her blood carries the chaotic potential of the other world. Yet, Raymondin remains faithful to his oath. For years, he accepts the wealth, the power, and the strange children, never questioning what his wife does behind the locked door of her chamber on Saturdays. He enjoys the benefits of the mermaid without confronting the reality of the monster. But in folklore, a taboo exists only to be broken. For years, the contract held. The prosperity of Lusignan relied entirely on Raymondin's willful blindness. However, the equilibrium of the fairy tale requires a disruptor. In the Roman de Melusine, this agent of chaos is Raymondin's brother, the Count of Forez. Visiting the castle on a Saturday, the Count notices Melusine's absence and weaponizes it. He plants a specific toxic seed in Raymondin's mind, the suggestion of infidelity. He mocks Raymondin, insinuating that Melusine's weekly retreat is merely a cover for an illicit affair with another knight. This accusation strikes at the heart of Raymondin's insecurity. The taboo of the Saturday had always required him to suspend his rational judgment in favor of trust. The Count's words destroy that suspension. Consumed by a sudden, overwhelming jealousy, Raymondin abandons his honor. He marches to the iron-reinforced door of his wife's private sanctuary. Finding it locked, he draws his dagger, the symbol of his martial aggression, and uses the point to bore a small, rough hole through the heavy oak. Putting his eye to the wood, Raymondin witnesses the truth that lies at the core of his dynasty. He sees Melusine bathing in a great marble basin. From the waist up, she remains the beautiful, pale woman who bore his children. But beneath the water, the deception dissolves. The text describes the transformation explicitly. Her legs have fused and mutated into the massive scaled tail of a serpent or a fish. In many visual depictions of this scene, specifically the manuscript illuminations of the 15th century, she is shown with the iconic double tail, splashing the water with a limb that represents the raw, untamed power of nature. The shock of this image transcends biology. It is fundamentally ontological. Raymondin realizes that he has married a monster. The culture hero who built his castles and churches is, in her private moments, a creature of the abyss. He is effectively married to the dragon Tiamat. This moment creates a profound psychological rupture. The beauty of his wife and the horror of the beast exist simultaneously in the same being. Crucially, Raymondin's reaction deviates from the standard monster slayer script. Upon seeing the tail, he does not burst in to kill the beast. He does not flee the castle in terror. Instead, he retreats into silence. He plugs the hole with wax and returns to his chambers, terrified not of the monster, but of losing her. He realizes that the infidelity was a lie, and that his wife remains loyal to him in her own way. He chooses to become complicit in the deception. This silence transforms the marriage into a conspiracy. Raymondin now carries the burden of the double-minded man. He knows that the foundation of his family's power is literally reptilian, yet he chooses to maintain the facade to preserve his status. He accepts the monster because the monster is useful. This act of suppression keeps the narrative going for years longer. But in the logic of tragedy, a secret of this magnitude acts as a pressurized vessel. It requires only a single spark of anger to cause the explosion that will destroy the House of Lusignan. The collapse of the House of Lusignan begins with a crime of fratricide. Geoffroy with the Great Tooth, the most monstrous of Melusine's sons, engages in a violent feud with his brother Froment, who has become a monk at the Abbey of Maillezais. In a fit of chaotic rage, Geoffroy burns the abbey to the ground, trapping Froment inside and burning him alive along with the other monks. When the news of this atrocity reaches the castle, Raymondin's fragile psychological dam finally bursts. Confronted with the undeniable evil of his offspring, he connects the crime of the son to the nature of the mother. In a crowded court, surrounded by his barons, Raymondin turns his grief into accusation. He points a finger at Melusine and shouts the fatal words recorded in the chronicles. "Out of my sight, you false serpent! You and your deeds are poisonous." With this public utterance, the wax plug is removed. Raymondin violates the unspoken secondary clause of their marriage, the agreement to keep the secret. By naming her a serpent in the public sphere, he collapses the wave function of her identity. She ceases to be the Lady of Lusignan and instantly reverts to her primordial form. Melusine's reaction is one of profound sorrow rather than rage. She laments that if Raymondin had only kept his silence, she could have lived out her days as a mortal woman and died a Christian death. Now, exposed by the truth, she is forced to return to the immortality of the abyss. She leaps to the windowsill, and the transformation completes itself. Rejecting the water, she takes to the air. Giant, membranous wings erupt from her shoulders, and her body elongates into a massive 15-foot serpent. She circles the towers of the castle 3 times, emitting a heart-rending, piercing cry, the cri de Melusine. This scream establishes a new function for the mermaid entity. She evolves from a culture hero into a banshee. Legend dictates that for centuries afterward, this dragon mother would return to the castle to scream 3 days before the death of a lord of Lusignan. She became the ancestral ghost of the family, a grim announcement of mortality that linked the blood of the kings to the blood of the monster. Yet, the legend preserves a shred of her humanity. The folklore insists that Melusine, despite her monstrous form, retained her maternal instinct. It was said that she visited the nursery at night to breastfeed her two youngest sons, Thierry and Raimonet. The wet nurses would see a shimmering shadow glide into the room, warm the child by the fire, and nurse him before vanishing at dawn. This detail complicates the medieval view of the monster. Melusine is a good monster, a creature whose love transcends her biological damnation. She represents the tragedy of the excluded mother, the woman demonized by the church and society, who nevertheless fights to protect her lineage. The legacy of this myth extended far beyond the nursery. The Plantagenet kings of England, including Richard the Lionheart, who were related to the Lusignans, actively embraced this monstrous ancestry. They used the legend of the demon brood as a tool of political intimidation. Richard the Lionheart is famously quoted as saying, "From the devil we came, and to the devil we will return." For the medieval aristocracy, descending from a mermaid dragon was a status symbol. It implied that their blood was volatile, dangerous, and distinct from the common man. Far from being a shameful secret, the mermaid stood as the ultimate proof of divine right, even if that divinity was dark. This marks the end of the mermaid's evolution in the realm of European myth. She had journeyed from the temples of Syria to the rocky cliffs of Greece, through the theology of the bestiaries, and finally into the royal genealogy of France. By the year 1400, the mermaid was a fixed cultural object, a beautiful woman with a fishtail, a mirror, and a tragic soul. But as the 15th century ended, the ships of Europe began to push into the unknown waters of the Atlantic and the Caribbean. There, the sailors would stop telling stories about Melusine and start reporting sightings of something far more confusing. The age of legend was over. The age of biology had begun. To understand why sane men began to see women with fishtails in the middle of the Atlantic, we must first reconstruct the neurochemical environment of the age of sail. For the modern observer, the ocean is a place of transit or leisure. For the 16th century sailor, the wooden world of the ship functioned as a floating sensory deprivation tank. The primary catalyst for the mermaid hallucination was the silence. The zone known as the Intertropical Convergence Zone, or the doldrums, presented a psychological terror far greater than the gale. Here, the trade winds collide and cancel each other out, creating vast pockets of barometric stagnation where a ship could remain trapped, motionless, for weeks or even months. In this vacuum of movement, the reality of the sailor collapsed. The environment stripped away all external stimuli. There was no change in scenery, no sound of wind, and no social variation. The human brain, when starved of input, initiates a defense mechanism known as the Ganzfeld effect. Faced with a visual field of undifferentiated blue water and white sky, the visual cortex begins to manufacture its own images to maintain neural activity. The mermaid often originated here as a neural misfire projected onto the blank canvas of the sea by a mind desperate for pattern and recognition. The physical conditions of these stagnant zones accelerated this mental decay. The region between 30 and 35 degrees latitude earned the grim moniker, the horse latitudes. As fresh water supplies dwindled during the long calm, captains faced a calculated logistical choice. To conserve water for the crew, they jettisoned the livestock. Sailors watched as horses were pushed overboard, swimming frantically in the ship's wake until they drowned or were taken by sharks. This spectacle of death introduced a specific trauma to the crew. The ocean became a graveyard of familiar terrestrial forms. When a sailor later stared into the deep and saw a seahorse or a human face, He was often unconsciously recollecting the real bodies he had seen consumed by the water. Furthermore, the water itself transformed during these periods of stagnation. Coleridge's rhyme of the Ancient Mariner captures the biological reality of the doldrums. The very deep did rot. Without the churning action of the wind and waves, the surface of the tropical ocean becomes a breeding ground for algae, jellyfish, and sargassum weed. The water thickens and changes color, taking on a slimy, gelatinous texture. For the dehydrated, sunstruck lookout, the boundary between the rotting sea and the solid land began to blur. The thick, weed-choked water looked walkable, inviting the delirious mind to step off the deck. The duty of the lookout exacerbated this psychosis. A sailor assigned to the crow's nest spent 4-hour shifts staring at the horizon, searching for a break in the line between sea and sky. This intense, singular focus induces a state of auto-hypnosis. Optometrists call this empty field myopia. The eye, lacking a focal point, lapses into a resting state of focus just a few feet ahead, blurring the distance. In this blurry, hypnotic state, a patch of floating seaweed, a seal, or a cresting wave resolves into a familiar shape. The brain, craving the image of a woman, the ultimate symbol of comfort, home, and intimacy, superimposes the female form onto the driftwood. This is the pareidolia of the lonely. Just as we see faces in clouds, the sailor saw women in the waves. However, the intensity of the isolation gave these visions a hallucinatory weight. They were not fleeting mistakes. They were persistent, interactive delusions. Sailors reported hearing them sing, seeing them comb their hair, or watching them breastfeed. These details function strictly as projections of memory rather than observations of marine biology. The sailor was seeing what he missed most. The mermaid was a collage of his wife, his mother, and the brothel, stitched together by a mind breaking under the strain of absolute silence. Finally, we must consider the temperature. The doldrums are a furnace. The wooden decks of a galleon absorbed the tropical sun until they radiated heat like an oven. The tar in the hull seams melted and bubbled. In this hyperthermic environment, the ocean represented the ultimate cooling release. The mermaid is almost always depicted as a creature of cool, refreshing water. Psychologically, the hallucination served as an invitation to coolness. The siren called the sailor to jump overboard, not just for desire, but for temperature regulation. The desire to embrace the mermaid was, in physiological terms, the desire to embrace the cold death of the water, to escape the burning hell of the ship. This isolation was merely the first layer of the trauma. The silence weakened the mind, but the diet destroyed the body. As the ship drifted, the fresh food rotted, and the crew was forced to rely on the salt beef and the biscuit. This dietary restriction introduced the second and perhaps most critical factor in the creation of the mermaid myth, the breakdown of the nervous system caused by the lack of vitamin C. While the heat and isolation softened the sailor's mind, the lack of vitamin C disintegrated his reality. Scurvy, or scorbutus, was the defining plague of the Age of Discovery. Historians estimate it killed 2 million sailors between 1500 and 1800, more than all storms, shipwrecks, and naval battles combined. To the pre-modern physician, it was a mystery. To the modern pathologist, it is the breakdown of collagen production. Collagen is the glue that binds the human body together. Without it, the body literally begins to unmake itself. The terrified sailor watching his gums turn black and his skin bruise spontaneously was witnessing his own biological dissolution. This physical collapse triggered a specific terrifying phenomenon known as the resurrection of wounds. Because scar tissue relies on collagen to maintain its integrity, advanced scurvy causes all old, healed wounds to break open. A slash from a sword received 20 years ago would suddenly split and bleed as if fresh. A bone broken in childhood would fracture again while the sailor lay in his hammock. This symptom provides a gruesome physical parallel to the psychological state of the siren's victim. Just as the siren of the Odyssey claimed to know all the toils of the past, scurvy forced the sailor to physically relive every injury he had ever suffered. The past literally reopened in his flesh, trapping him in a cycle of pain and memory. The neurological effects of scurvy are less documented, but equally profound. The disease affects the production of neurotransmitters, leading to severe emotional lability and a specific form of delirium known to maritime historians as calenture. This condition manifests as a sudden, irresistible hallucination where the sailor perceives the sea around him not as water but as green fields. The blue waves transform into rolling pastures, and the foam appears as flowers or sheep. This delusion creates a direct, fatal impulse. Sailors suffering from calenture would attempt to leap from the deck, believing they were jumping into a meadow to rest. This medical reality creates a staggering connection to the original myth. The Homeric sirens lived in a flowery meadow surrounded by the sea. The sailor dying of scurvy literally sees this meadow. The siren's call, in this context, is the brain's desperate interpretation of the calenture, a sensory error that disguises the deadly ocean as a safe terrestrial home. The mermaid is the avatar of this fatal nostalgia. Alongside the visual hallucinations, the disintegration of the nervous system produced auditory anomalies. Advanced scurvy and severe dehydration often result in tinnitus, a constant ringing or buzzing in the ears. In the silence of the doldrums, the brain amplifies this internal noise, attempting to decode it into recognizable speech or music. The song of the siren was often the sound of the sailor's own dying auditory nerves. The content of these auditory hallucinations followed the law of desire. A man starving to death dreams of banquets. A man dying of isolation dreams of voices. The voices he heard were inevitably female because the female voice represented the nurse, the mother, and the lover. The three archetypes of care that were absent in the hypermasculine, brutal environment of the ship. The siren was the projection of the desperate need for compassion. She sang to him because no one else would. This medical analysis reframes the mermaid of the Age of Sail. She differs fundamentally from the predator of the Odyssey or the demon of the church. She is a symptom of softness. In the brutal hierarchy of the Royal Navy or the Merchant Marine, weakness was punished and sickness was a liability. The mermaid represented the only entity in the ocean who offered a soft landing. When a sailor saw a mermaid, he was often in the terminal stages of metabolic collapse. She was the harbinger of death, but she was not the cause of death. She was the palliative care provided by a breaking mind. She arrived when the collagen failed, when the old wounds opened, and when the ocean looked like a meadow. She was the final comfort mechanism of the brain, disguising the horror of a scurvy death with the beautiful face of a woman who promised that the water was not cold and that the drowning would not hurt. This physiological context explains the persistence of the myth long after the map was filled in. Science could explain the tides and the stars, but it struggled to explain the madness that seized men after 3 months without fresh fruit. The mermaid hid in the blind spot of medical knowledge, thriving on the biological vulnerability of the human explorer. She was the ghost in the machine of the body. The most famous mermaid sighting in history occurred on January 9th, 1493, off the coast of what is now the Dominican Republic. Christopher Columbus, sailing the Niña back towards Spain, recorded in his logbook that he saw 3 sirens rising high out of the sea. This encounter serves as the perfect historical laboratory to test the expectation theory of mythology. Columbus entered the Caribbean with a prepared mind, conditioned by the library of medieval texts he carried in his cabin. He possessed a heavily annotated copy of the Travels of Marco Polo. He believed devoutly that he was on the fringes of the East Indies. His worldview demanded that the ocean contained specific monsters to validate his location. If he was truly near the realm of the Great Khan, the waters required the presence of sirens, just as the maps dictated. Therefore, when 3 dark shapes broke the surface of the Rio del Oro, his brain immediately categorized them according to the myth. He saw what he needed to see to prove he was right. However, the reality of the Caribbean fauna refused to cooperate with the fantasy of the Greek archipelago. The creatures Columbus saw were West Indian manatees, massive, herbivorous marine mammals weighing up to 1,000 pounds. While they possess a tail and finger-like bones in their flippers, they lack the humanoid grace of the legend. This collision between the mental image and the physical object resulted in one of the most famously understated lines in maritime history. Columbus writes, "They were not as beautiful as they are painted, although to some extent they have a human appearance in the face." This sentence captures the precise moment the myth began to die. Columbus admits the aesthetic failure of the creature. He acknowledges that the painting, the cultural expectation, was a lie. By describing them as possessing a human appearance in the face, he is likely referencing the manatee's deep-set eyes and whiskered snout, which can look startlingly like a grumpy old man when viewed from a distance. The siren had devolved from a goddess of lethal beauty into an ugly curiosity. Columbus explicitly notes that the creatures had masculine traits. This observation is critical. It signifies the decoupling of the siren from the concept of desire. For 3,000 years, from Atargatis to the Melusine, the mermaid functioned as an icon of hyperfemininity and dangerous desire. Columbus's logbook stripped her of this power. A masculine siren offers no temptation. She poses no moral threat to the Christian soul. She is simply a beast. This sighting marks the transition from the age of legend to the age of zoology. Columbus treated the sirens not as magical entities to be feared, but as biological specimens to be noted. He did not plug his ears. He merely critiqued their appearance. By recording their ugliness, he secularized them. The Caribbean siren ceased to be a demon of the abyss and became merely a disappointing animal that would later be hunted for its meat and hide. To comprehend the survival of the mermaid myth in the face of biological reality, we must analyze the gender dynamics of the age of sail. For centuries, the maritime world operated as a strictly exclusionary male enclave. Women were ritually banned from naval vessels, driven by the superstition that their presence angered the seas. This prohibition created a void of femininity. The ship became a monastery of violence and labor, devoid of the feminine principle. Yet, the human psyche abhors such a vacuum. To compensate for this absence, the sailor projected an intense, hyper-feminine persona onto the ocean itself. This projection manifested physically in the figurehead. The wooden woman carved onto the prow served as the ship's soul and the crew's collective mother-lover. Sailors spent months staring at this wooden effigy, the only female form allowed in their world. Folklore dictates that a bare woman can calm a storm, a belief that stems from the ancient idea that the sea, masculine chaos in this specific context, is shamed into submission by the beauty of the female form. The mermaid, therefore, acted as the animated version of the figurehead. She was the wooden woman brought to life, the phantom companion who swam alongside the hull, promising that the feminine still existed somewhere in the void. This desire demanded a permanent physical totem, the tattoo. The image of the mermaid became the single most common motif inked into the skin of the deep-sea sailor. This act of branding served a dual psychological purpose. First, it functioned as a marriage to the sea. By marking his body with the avatar of the ocean, the sailor acknowledged that he belonged to the water more than the land. The mermaid on the arm replaced the wedding ring on the finger. Second, the tattoo served as a talisman of sympathetic magic. In the logic of superstition, carrying the image of the destroyer protects you from destruction. By wearing the mermaid, the sailor hoped to seduce the ocean into mercy. It was an attempt to control the uncontrollable element through erotic familiarity. If the ocean is a woman, perhaps she can be wooed, loved, or at least satisfied. This anthropomorphism turned the terrifying indifference of nature into a relational dynamic, however abusive. However, the projection of lust carried a dark, medical undercurrent. The age of discovery coincided with the explosion of the great pox across Europe. For the sailor, the port city was a place of release, but also of infection. The mermaid evolved into a coded warning against the dangers of unregulated vice. In this context, the fishtail took on a new, gruesome significance. It represented the hidden corruption of the body, the beautiful face of the woman masking the diseased, inhuman reality beneath the waist. The mermaid became the archetype of the femme fatale in her purest form. She offers a moment of pleasure that results in eternal ruin. The burning sensation of the siren's touch served as a folklore metaphor for the burning of the affliction. This anxiety fundamentally altered the nature of the hallucination. The sailor's desire for the mermaid was inextricably bound to his fear of her. She represented the poisoned gift, the woman who consumes the man who enters her. This fear coalesced into the ultimate maritime fantasy, the drowning kiss. In the folklore of the 17th and 18th centuries, the mermaid does not eat the sailor like a shark, or starve him like the Greek Siren. She takes him down to her underwater kingdom to be her lover. This narrative reframed death by drowning as an act of erotic abduction. It provided a comforting euphemism for the families left behind. The sailor wasn't lost at sea or eaten by crabs. He was taken by a mermaid. Psychologically, this myth offered the sailor a way to eroticize his own mortality. Facing the constant threat of a violent, cold death, the mind replaces the crushing pressure of the deep with the embrace of a lover. It turns the end of life into the ultimate climax. The mermaid is the only monster in human history who kills you by loving you too much. She is the personification of the death drive, Thanatos, disguised as the vital instinct. Thus, the persistence of the mermaid myth in the Age of Reason, far from being a failure of zoology, represented a triumph of psychology. The sailor knew, logically, that the manatee was a grey lump of blubber. But the sailor needed the mermaid. He needed a face to put on the chaos. He needed a reason to explain why he kept returning to the ocean that tried to kill him. He went back because she called him. The dismantling of the mermaid myth was not achieved by theologians or poets, but by the taxonomists of the Enlightenment. In the 18th century, science finally caught up to the legend. Biologists classified the animals responsible for millennia of confusion into the order Sirenia. a name that ironically memorializes the very myth it destroyed. This order includes the dugong of the Indo-Pacific and the manatee of the Atlantic. When dissected by the cold eye of science, the anatomy of these creatures reveals exactly why they tricked the ancient world. The deception relies on two specific biological traits. First, the Sirenia possess pectoral mammary glands located under the flippers, essentially armpits. When a female manatee nurses her calf, she often bobs upright in the water, clutching the young to her chest with her flippers in a posture that is startlingly humanoid. From a distance, this silhouette mimics a woman breastfeeding at sea. Second, the flipper itself contains a skeletal structure of 5 distinct digits. The manatee swims with a hand encased in a mitten of flesh. These anatomical coincidences provided just enough data for the pattern-seeking human brain to construct a monster. However, the classification of Sirenia brought about a darker shift in the relationship between man and mermaid. Once the creature was identified as an animal, it ceased to be a demon to be feared and became a resource to be harvested. The tragedy of Stella's sea cow serves as the grim punctuation mark to this history. Discovered in the Bering Sea in 1741, this massive relative of the manatee, the largest siren to ever exist, was hunted to total extinction within 27 years of its discovery. This extinction event represents the final conquest of the myth. The siren of the ancients had the power to kill men with her song. The siren of the modern era was clubbed to death for her blubber. Humanity had gone beyond demystifying the monster. It had consumed it. The divine terror of the Assyrian goddess Atargatis had been reduced to a barrel of oil and a side of salted meat. While the biologists classified the living animals, the hustlers of Europe manufactured the dead ones. As the scientific revolution took hold, the public appetite for wonders shifted from religious relics to natural oddities. This demand created a lucrative black market for the Jenny Hanover. Originating in the dockside slums of Antwerp and Venice, these objects were grotesque forgeries created by drying the carcasses of rays, skates, or guitarfish. The anatomy of a ray creates a natural, if horrifying, optical illusion. On the underside of the fish, the nostrils and mouth form a face that looks disturbingly human. Sailors and taxidermists would manipulate the drying cartilage, twisting the pectoral fins to resemble arms and the pelvic fins to resemble legs. They would then lacquer the corpse to preserve it. These dragons, or mermaids, were sold to wealthy collectors for their cabinets of curiosity, Wunderkammer. The Jenny Hanover represents the mermaid stripped of all romance. It is a dried husk, a piece of taxidermy born not from folklore, but from the cynicism of the marketplace. The final degradation of the mermaid occurred in New York City in 1842. The showman P.T. Barnum introduced the Fiji mermaid to the American public. Unlike the Jenny Hanover, which was a modified fish, this object was a Frankensteinian splice, the mummified torso of a juvenile monkey sewn expertly onto the tail of a large fish. Barnum engineered a massive publicity campaign, planting fake naturalist reports in newspapers to vouch for the creature's authenticity. Thousands paid to see the Siren of the South Seas, expecting the beautiful temptress of the posters. What they found was a shriveled, hideous corpse with bared teeth and a grimace of eternal agony. Yet, the crowds did not riot. They accepted the hoax as entertainment. This moment marks the death of the mermaid as a genuine belief system. She was no longer a goddess, Atargatis, a demon, Physiologus, or a hallucination, Columbus. She was a humbug, She had become a commodity of the entertainment industry. Today, the mermaid exists only as a fairy tale for children and a logo for coffee. The fear is gone. The Little Mermaid of Hans Christian Andersen, memorialized in bronze in Copenhagen, is a creature of total self-sacrifice who dissolves into sea foam. She is the final, neutered version of the archetype, voiceless and harmless. Yet, when we look back at the 3,000-year history of this entity, we see something far more complex than a Disney princess. We see a mirror of human anxiety. We see Atagatis, the shame of the gods. We see the Siren, the danger of knowledge. We see Melusine, the tragedy of the mother. And we see the manatee, the disappointment of reality. The mermaid always transcended the simple definition of a fishwoman. She was the shape we gave to the water, so that we could talk to the unknown. And though we now know she isn't real, we still look at the ocean and wait, just for a moment, to see if she breaks the surface.